Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Whitney Kosters, professor of English. Here on YouTube, I examine the stories that continue to resonate across generations because literature becomes most powerful when it turns into a cultural conversation, one that includes everyone engaging with the text. If that's a conversation you would like to be part of, I invite you to subscribe. Today, we are going to examine A Christmas Carol in a way that goes beyond the familiar cultural myth. We're going to look at the text itself, its symbolic and rhetorical architecture, and the historical world that produced it. A world where Christmas was saturated with ghost stories and emerging Victorian culture, shaped by winter superstition, folkloric remnants, and rituals that might surprise you. Once you understand the cultural and literary context Dickens was writing into, the story becomes far stranger and richer and more intellectually interesting than this cheerful public image that it now has. Every December, A Christmas Carol returns to us with the persistence of a haunting. It doesn't simply reappear, it materializes. It slips into store windows, holiday movies, school plays, radio dramatizations, and streaming menus as though summoned by some ancient seasonal instinct. We think of it as a cheerful Christmas classic, but when we strip away the layers of modern comfort that have settled over it, we can rediscover that something far stranger and more powerful is happening. This is a ghost story, not a gentle fairy tale with an uplifting moral, but a work saturated with supernatural visitation, psychological excavation, and the Victorian era's fascination with the macabre. Dickens himself called it a ghost story of Christmas, and Victorian readers recognized the resonance of that phrase. There was already a developing tradition of wintertime ghost tales, later intensified by Dickens and other Victorian writers. Readers understood that this was not a story meant only to warm the heart, but to unsettle the spirit, expose the past, interrogate the present, and reveal the future. To understand why Dickens turned to ghosts, we have to understand the world he wrote for. 19th century Christmas was not yet the glittering festival we know. Christmas cards had just been invented in 1843, the same year this story was published. Even traditions we now take for granted were still taking shape. Christmas crackers, for example, those little paper tubes that pop open to reveal tiny toys or paper crowns, would not be invented until later in the 1840s, after Dickens had written the carol. Christmas trees were growing popular thanks to Victoria and Albert. The season was evolving, absorbing new traditions while still carrying older folkloric associations. One winter tradition, however, had long-standing roots: telling ghost stories. Winter had often been considered in some folk traditions a thin time, a season when darkness stretched long, the cold pressed heavily, and the boundaries between the living and dead seemed permeable. Earlier European and especially some Celtic folklore described midwinter nights when spirits wandered or when strange noises on the wind could be interpreted as omens. Even Christmas, long before the Victorians reinvented it, carried threads of eeriness. Plum pudding, now iconic, began as a medieval spice pottage before evolving into the steamed dessert Victorians knew. Wassailing, an older custom of singing and drinking, had ghostly undertones as well. It was rooted partly in appeasing orchard spirits for a good harvest. The Yule log had associations with protection and good fortune, and mistletoe, long before romance, functioned as a talisman against misfortune. Holly also symbolized protection in older traditions, though later interpretations elaborated on its uses. The season was festive, but it was also uncanny. Victorian culture inherited these associations and expanded them. Their world was steeped in death and ritual. Elaborate mourning customs shaped daily life. Mirrors were draped after a death, partly for etiquette and partly reflecting older beliefs about reflections and the spirits of the dead. Locks of hair were clipped and woven into jewelry. Post-mortem photographs, these solemn portraits taken after death, were common. In some ways, death lived inside Victorian homes. Victorian mourning culture also included several striking practices. Bodies were often kept in the home's best parlors for days, allowing family members to sit vigil. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death, symbolically freezing time, and mourning jewelry made from jet signaled the degree of grief. These customs created a world in which the boundary between life and death felt close, shaping the Victorian imagination and normalizing ghostly themes in literature. Beyond mourning, interest in the supernatural flourished, although formal spiritualism involving seances and spirit rapping would not rise to prominence until the later 1840s and beyond. But still, fascination with ghostly possibility permeated the culture. Organizations such as the Ghost Club, founded in 1862, show how mainstream supernatural inquiry would become later in the century. Dickens lived in a world receptive to supernatural themes even before organized spiritualism took hold. He would go on to write a ghost story almost every Christmas for decades, making the carol the beginning and not the exception of his seasonal supernatural tradition. Though skeptical of formal spiritualism, Dickens deeply believed in the psychological reality of ghosts, the way memory, guilt, and emotional haunting shape life. The carol reflects this belief, using spirits not as literal phantoms, but as embodiments of the human mind's hidden chambers. But Dickens used ghosts not merely to frighten, he used them to break open a human heart. Before any apparition arrives, Dickens constructs Scrooge as a man sealed in emotional frost. Scrooge's inner cold saturates the opening. He carries his own temperature, he freezes the office, he recoils from warmth as if warmth were dangerous. This isn't casual description, it is structural. Dickens wants us to understand that Scrooge's coldness is the condition the story must thaw. Scrooge is not evil. He's hardened, armored, and wounded in ways we don't yet know. Dickens's humor prevents readers from despising him because if we hated him, we couldn't witness his transformation. Then Marley arrives. Marley's ghost is the threshold between realism and supernatural reckoning. The scene, Marley's face in the knocker, the bell's eerie vibrations, the slow emergence of the ghost wrapped in chains, is Gothic perfection. Victorian readers instantly understood the symbolism. Marley's chains were not instruments of torture, they were consequences. In Victorian Christian moral philosophy, the soul's condition reflected earthly choices. Marley appears as the embodiment of a misdirected life. But he's a messenger, not a tormentor. His visit is frightening because truth is frightening. When he warns Scrooge about the three spirits, he ushers in a structure reminiscent of ancient initiation: a descent, a confrontation, and a rebirth. The Ghost of Christmas Past is Dickens's most enigmatic spirit, flickering between ages, bright yet shadowed. It represents memory in all its complexity: nostalgic, painful, illuminating, destabilizing. Victorian readers recognize the flame atop its head as a symbol of enlightenment. Memory is illumination, and illumination can burn. When the past brings Scrooge to his childhood schoolroom, Dickens delivers one of his most quietly devastating scenes. The cold, isolated room becomes an emotional mirror, a childhood shaped by absence and loneliness. Dickens himself experienced deep childhood trauma, forced into factory labor when his father was imprisoned for debt. And while Scrooge's story is not autobiographical, Dickens understood the emotional terrain intimately. Then come the visions that reveal Scrooge's lost inner life. His childhood books, Ali Baba, Robinson Crusoe, Valentine and Orson, these materialize before him. Victorian readers recognize these symbols of childhood imagination. Their reappearance shows Scrooge had once possessed wonder, creativity, and warmth. Fezziwig's joyous ball contrasts sharply with Scrooge's later life. Fezziwig embodies generosity and community, and when Scrooge sees this memory, he feels its loss. Then comes Belle, whose gentle release reveals Scrooge's transformation from a man capable of love to a man grounded increasingly by fear of poverty, fear of vulnerability. His miserliness is not greed, it's fear hardened into habit, as many scholars interpret it. When Scrooge grasps at the ghost's cap to smother the light, Dickens literalizes a universal impulse, the desire to extinguish a painful memory. The Ghost of Christmas Present bursts into the story as abundance incarnate. Towering, robed in green, surrounded by overflowing foods, he represents festivity rooted in ancient custom. Dickens drew partly from the older English Father Christmas, a figure of hospitality and seasonal revelry rather than gift-giving. The present becomes both celebratory and moral. The Cratchits' home shows joy amid scarcity. Tiny Tim is not just sentimental, he is a reminder of vulnerable lives affected by systems Scrooge endorses. Dickens extends the visions: miners deep underground, sailors in winter storms, families throughout England celebrating in every circumstance. Christmas becomes a universal human instinct towards togetherness. But Dickens delivers his sharpest critique when the present reveals ignorance and want, two neglected children who represent society's failures. Victorian readers understood the allegory instantly. The Poor Law of 1834, which Dickens despised, punished poverty rather than relieving it. The present's warning to beware this boy, or ignorance, was politically pointed. And as the present ages rapidly through the night, Dickens underscores that generosity is fleeting unless acted upon. The ghost of Christmas yet to come arrives in stark silence. Faceless, draped in black, the spirit evokes Victorian mourning culture, veils, funerals, and graveyards. This ghost terrifies not with theatrics, but with stillness. It reveals businessmen discussing a death with indifference, thieves stripping a corpse of his possessions, a family relieved by the death of a harsh creditor, and finally, a neglected grave. The brilliance of the sequence is that Scrooge's horror emerges before he realizes the dead man is himself. He responds with fear and revulsion that precede recognition. The ghost shows possibility, not destiny. What will be if nothing changes? When Scrooge awakens on Christmas morning, Dickens gives us a moment of pure rebirth. The carol also shaped real-world philanthropy. Contemporary newspapers reported a noticeable spike in charitable giving that Christmas, showing that Dickens' story acted not just as fiction, but as a cultural catalyst. Scrooge's exuberance, laughing, crying, overwhelmed, is earned. Each spirit dismantled part of his armor. The past broke denial, the present broke indifference, and the future broke hopelessness. His transformation is not miraculous, it is the result of confrontation and recognition. Dickens' own life shaped this architecture. His childhood was marked by instability, labor, and the humiliation of poverty. The carol's publication history is equally revealing. The first edition sold out within days, but Dickens earned far less than expected because he insisted on high-quality production, gilt edges, hand-colored illustrations, and fine binding. Meanwhile, pirated stage adaptations appeared within weeks, prompting Dickens to pursue legal action that ultimately cost him money. These experiences left an imprint on his work. Scrooge's fears echo Dickens' own anxiety about money and vulnerability. Perhaps this is why Dickens performed the carol with such emotional intensity. His public readings were famously powerful. Contemporary reports claim that audiences wept, gasped, and even fainted. For Dickens, this story was not entertainment, it was emotional truth. This is why A Christmas Carol endures. The ghosts are not simply supernatural guides, they are the structure of human time, memory, awareness, and possibility. The story shows us that transformation begins when we confront where we've been, where we are, and where we might go. Each December, the carol returns like a ritual visitation. The question it asks, though, is not who was Scrooge, but which ghost is standing before you? Is it the past illuminating wounds and lost joys, the present revealing realities you've ignored, or the future silently showing the shape of your choices? Dickens' message is that the ghosts do not come to punish, they come to awaken. They remind us that we can step out of fear, habit, and isolation into a life of connection, imagination, and compassion. There is still time to change the course of our story for all of us, even today, before the future writes it for us. I would love to hear about your relationship with A Christmas Carol and your thoughts on my lecture today. Please share in the comment section below, subscribe, and check out my other videos for more insight into literature. Merry Christmas, happy holidays, and be well.